Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
We all know that sugar is something that we should really try to avoid at all costs when it comes to our dietary intake. But when we look at the mental health implications that go along with high sugar intake, this is when it becomes incredibly alarming. I'm Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the true impact that sugars have when it comes to our mental health. When we look at our society as a whole, we know that Americans certainly intake way too much sugar. The average American adult consumes roughly around 75-80 grams of sugar per day, which is 3 times the recommended amount. And when we look at the areas where so much of these sugars are coming from, we can look at a lot of the sugary beverages, but also all of the high processed foods or the ultra processed foods that so many Americans take in each and every single day. When you look at how much sugar would be considered to be acceptable, you're looking at roughly around 6 teaspoons per day. And we are talking Americans are just doing a horrible job. When you think that we are taking in 3 times the amount of sugar, and then you start to look at all of the health implications beyond that of just diabetes. You know, that's the first thing that most people think about is becoming a diabetic. Well, clearly we know that there's that direct correlation, but we also have to look at the mental health implications. And there was data that was collected over in the UK, and this was an absolutely fascinating study. They followed a group of over 10,000 men and women for 30 years. This study was done between the years 1983 and 2013. And what they were looking at was their dietary intake of processed sugars and looking at if there was any type of an increased risk for developing disorders such as anxiety and depression. And the reason why this is so critical to draw this correlation is because when we look at the statistics in this country here in the United States, when you're looking at anxiety and depression, we're looking at over 40 million adults throughout the United States who suffer from these conditions. And understanding, okay, Americans are taking in 3 times the amount of sugar that they should every single day. And then you look at the rate of anxiety and depression, and it is just such a strong correlation between this. So this study done over in the UK was called the Whitehall 2 study, and this really drove home the point. Over in the UK, what they assessed is that people in the UK are having 2 times the amount of sugar intake, where here in the United States is 3 times the amount. And what they were able to see from tracking these folks over that course of 30 years was that those who had that double intake on average per day of that sugar had a significantly increased risk of developing a mental disorder when compared to the folks in the group who had a lower sugar intake. Now, this is once again a very alarming study because what they have predicted is that by the year 2030, so not even a decade away, that major depression will be the leading cause of disability in economically privileged countries. So what does that mean? That means places like the UK, here in the United States. There is this very strong correlation, and we know that foods play a role into this. There was a study that was done out of James Cook University where they were looking at the dietary intake of fast foods and processed foods in a very unique population. So they were over in the Torres Strait Island, and they were looking at folks who lived on one of the islands where they had much greater access to processed foods and fast foods versus a very isolated island where they were just living basically off of the land, consuming fish, fruits and vegetables. And there was a direct correlation between those who had access to junk food or fast food and a high risk of developing anxiety and depression once again. So we can see these correlations and we can say, okay, well, yeah, this is a big problem. In the Scientific Reports Journal back in 2017, they were looking at the sugar intake from sweet food and beverages, and they were looking at common mental health disorders and depression. Now, this was all kind of piggybacked off of that Whitehall 2 study that was done over in the UK, where they tracked those folks over that 30-year time frame. And they said that the sugar consumption is really being targeted as this main driver when it comes to not only diabetes and obesity, but also when it comes to major mental health issues such as depression and anxiety. And understanding that this higher sugar intake is something that is incredibly problematic. I always say when we think about sugar, we have to recognize that sugar in the human body, in a sense, is working like a drug. So we can kind of look and say, okay, we have all these Americans that are consuming triple the amount of sugar every day. So it's basically kind of one of their drugs that they are taking in on a daily basis, because we know how it's working within the brain and the different communication pathways to which the sugar itself is tripping everything up. So looking at this study and really kind of extrapolating out the data from this, they were able to see the different factors that high sugar intake was making on quality of life. They were looking at physical activity. They were looking at quality of sleep. And then, of course, they were also looking at all of the different markers when it came to cardiovascular disease, when it came to weight, body mass index, all of these different factors, and then looking at mental health status at the same time. And that direct correlation, once again, was definitely shown. So this is a very simple fix. We stop with the sugary beverages, we stop with the processed foods, and we start eating whole foods again. And we start to consume things like water or green tea to drink, as opposed to drinking sugar water, which we know is just incredibly detrimental to our energy status and to our overall sense of well-being. Now, in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, they were looking at the evidence of the importance of dietary habits regarding depressive symptoms and depression. And once again, finding that connection between high sugar intake and the likelihood of developing anxiety and depression. Sometimes it's a comorbid. It's not only being depressed, but also having anxiety on top of that. So we understand, once again, when we go back and we look and we say, okay, anxiety disorder itself is highly treatable. Unfortunately, many people who have anxiety, they are given anxiolytic drugs, but they're never given the advice that they should change their diet. Perhaps it's their diet that's driving so much of this. It's basically disrupting the normal communication pathways within the brain, which is incredibly problematic. So at the end of the day, we know that the science is out there. We should, at this point in time, understand that the foods that we take in, the things that we drink each and every single day, play a significant role in our existence. And when we think about heart health, brain health, mental health, we have to start to make those shifts in terms of lifestyle and dietary modifications in order to stop this slow burning forest fire that is occurring. Because like I said, they are estimating that by 2030, that depression will be the most common form of disability in all of the industrialized countries. And that is very frightening because this is self-induced. And so we have to be able to change this. We know that there is a significant increased risk for depressive symptoms when people adhere to a Western diet. There is, by some estimates 40-65% increase just because of the foods that you're eating. And so if we can make those changes, we can make a huge difference in terms of how we feel on a daily basis. So that is all that I have for you for today. I want to thank you so much for tuning into the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.